I said I'd make a video because some of you are saying that you don't believe it's my...
In the final hours of Sinéad O'Connor's life, there was no spotlight, no stage, and no crowd waiting to hear her voice. There was only silence inside a quiet London flat, where the world's most defiant singer slowly faded from view. For decades, Sinéad was known as a woman who never backed down. She challenged institutions, exposed abuse, and absorbed hatred that would have crushed most people. But in her last days, the fight had grown unbearably quiet. No interviews, no public appearances. Just a series of warning signs that, in hindsight, felt impossible to ignore. Her death was quickly described as not suspicious. And yet, when you rewind the weeks, the days, and the final hours leading up to that moment, a different story begins to emerge. One shaped by grief, isolation, mental illness, and a lifetime of being misunderstood. What really happened in Sinéad O'Connor's final hours? How did one of the bravest voices in modern music end her life alone after years of publicly crying out for help? Tonight, we slow time down. We return to those last moments and trace the long, painful road that led her there. The news broke quietly at first, then spread with a sudden weight that felt almost physical. Within minutes, headlines began to multiply. Social media feeds froze, refreshed, and filled with the same sentence repeated in disbelief: Sinéad O'Connor is dead. For many, the reaction was immediate shock. For others, it was a stunned, heavy silence, the kind that settles when a tragedy feels both sudden and cruelly predictable. Radio stations paused their playlists. Television anchors struggled to choose the right words. Fans gathered online, posting fragments of lyrics, old interviews, and performances that once felt defiant, fearless, alive. What made the impact so profound was not just who she was, but what she represented. Sinéad O'Connor was never simply a singer. She was a symbol of resistance, vulnerability, and truth-telling in an industry built on illusion. Her voice had carried pain, rage, tenderness, and moral clarity in equal measure. And now, that voice was gone, found silent in a city far from home. Almost immediately, the same questions began to surface across media outlets and comment sections. How could this happen now? Hadn't she survived worse? Hadn't she already faced public hatred, professional exile, and personal loss and kept going? Official statements were careful. Authorities said there were no suspicious circumstances. The wording was calm, procedural, final. But outside those statements, a different conversation was unfolding, one filled with unease. Because this wasn't just a celebrity death. It felt like the end of a long, unresolved struggle that the public had witnessed in fragments for years. In the hours that followed, fellow musicians spoke of her courage. Activists called her a prophet who had been ignored too long. Fans revisited the moments when she had warned the world about abuse, about trauma, about the cost of silence, and had been mocked for it. And slowly, another realization set in. This was not the story of a sudden collapse. It was the final chapter of a life that had been unraveling in public view, one post, one interview, one cry for help at a time. To understand how the world arrived at this moment, we have to rewind far beyond the headlines. Back to the beginnings. Back to the forces that shaped Sinéad O'Connor long before her final hours ever began. Long before the world knew her name, Sinéad O'Connor learned what it meant to survive pain in silence. She was born into a childhood shaped by instability, violence, and emotional neglect, experiences she would later describe not as isolated trauma, but as a constant state of fear. Music became her refuge early on, not as a dream of fame, but as a place where she could finally breathe. Her voice, raw, untrained, and piercingly honest, carried something listeners couldn't quite explain, but immediately felt. When Sinéad emerged in the late 1980s, she didn't arrive polished or obedient. She arrived intense, vulnerable, uncompromising. At a time when the industry rewarded conformity, she refused it completely. Her shaved head, her refusal to be sexualized, her willingness to speak openly about abuse and injustice, all of it marked her as different, and therefore dangerous. Success came fast. Her music traveled across borders, her face appeared everywhere, and with the global success of a single song, she became one of the most recognizable voices on the planet. But even at her peak, something was already wrong. Behind the performances, Sinéad struggled with emotional instability, anxiety, and the lingering effects of trauma that fame could not erase. Interviews from that era reveal a woman already exhausted by the demands placed on her by record labels, by journalists, by a public that wanted her pain to be inspirational but never uncomfortable. Then came the moment that would redefine her public image forever. When Sinéad publicly protested institutional abuse on live television, in front of millions, the backlash was swift and merciless. She was banned, mocked, blacklisted. Her warning was dismissed. Her career was damaged overnight. Years later, the world would admit she was right. But at the time, Sinéad paid the price alone. What followed was not a simple fall from grace, but a slow erosion. Albums released to shrinking attention, financial struggles, custody battles. A growing sense that the world only remembered her when it needed a symbol, never when she needed support. And through it all, she kept speaking. Each confession was met with fascination, sympathy, and eventually fatigue. The public listened, but only briefly, then moved on. By the time Sinéad reached the later chapters of her life, she was no longer fighting for success. She was fighting to stay alive, and the darkest blow was still to come. As the years passed, the distance between Sinéad O'Connor's public legacy and her private reality grew wider and more dangerous. She spoke openly about her struggles with mental illness, long before such conversations were widely accepted. Diagnoses changed over time. Medications came and went. Stability arrived briefly, then slipped away again. Each attempt to explain herself publicly seemed to invite another wave of scrutiny, another round of judgment disguised as concern. What made Sinéad's collapse different from many others was that it unfolded in plain sight. She posted messages that sounded like cries for help. She spoke about loneliness with disarming clarity. She admitted, again and again, that she was not okay, and yet the response was fragmented support, mixed with ridicule, empathy drowned out by sensational headlines. In the background, practical pressures mounted. Financial instability followed years of inconsistent income. Legal disputes added stress. Relationships fractured under the weight of her emotional volatility and constant public exposure. The systems meant to protect artists' management, industry institutions, media ethics were largely absent, but the deepest wound was personal. The loss of her son shattered what remained of her emotional foundation. Those close to her later described a grief so profound it seemed to swallow everything else. After that moment, Sinéad's messages changed tone. They were no longer just warnings. They were declarations of unbearable pain. She described existing rather than living. She wrote about waking up with dread. She spoke of being kept alive rather than supported. For anyone reading closely, the trajectory was terrifyingly clear. And yet, nothing stopped. The world continued to consume her words as content. Each post became a headline. Each breakdown was dissected. The line between awareness and exploitation blurred beyond recognition. Sinéad had spent her life telling the truth, even when it cost her everything. In the end, the truth she told most often was the one people struggled hardest to hear. That survival requires more than applause, more than belated apologies, more than posthumous praise. By the time she reached the final phase of her life, the battle was no longer public or political. It was intimate, exhausting, quiet. and the signs that something irreversible was approaching were already there. In the weeks leading up to her death, Sinéad O'Connor's world grew smaller. Public appearances stopped. Interviews disappeared. The voice that once challenged governments and institutions now surfaced only in fragments, brief messages, second-hand updates, long stretches of silence that felt heavier than words. To those who had followed her closely, the quiet was alarming. She had moved away from the places that once defined her career and settled into a life marked by isolation. London became a temporary refuge, a city where she could blend into the background, far from the relentless scrutiny that had followed her for decades. But anonymity did not bring peace. It only made the loneliness more complete. Those who had spoken with her during this period later described a woman weighed down by exhaustion, not the kind that comes from work or travel, but the deeper fatigue of someone who has been fighting for too long against forces too large to name. There were plans that never materialized. Creative ideas discussed, then quietly abandoned. Conversations that ended without follow-up. The pattern was familiar to anyone who had watched her life unfold, hope flickering briefly, then fading. What made these final weeks especially painful in hindsight was how clearly they echoed earlier warnings. She had spoken about feeling disconnected from the world, about struggling to find meaning after unbearable loss, about waking up each day with the sense that something essential had been taken from her and would never return. There were no dramatic final statements, no carefully composed farewell. Instead, there was absence, the kind that often precedes tragedy. Friends and fans would later ask the same question, over and over again. If so many signs were there, why did nothing change? Because sometimes, suffering does not announce itself with urgency. Sometimes, it simply settles in, quietly, until the moment it becomes irreversible. As the final day approached, there was nothing to suggest a public event, a crisis, or a sudden turn. Just another morning. Another quiet room. Another chapter closing without witnesses. And then, time stopped. What is known about Sinéad O'Connor's final 24 hours is limited, and that absence of detail is, in itself, part of the story. There were no confirmed visitors, no public schedule, no recorded calls or messages released to the press. According to reports, she was alone in her London residence, a quiet space that had become both refuge and enclosure. The city outside moved on as usual: traffic, footsteps, distant sirens, while inside, time slowed to a near standstill. The final day did not begin with alarm. There were no emergency calls in the early hours. No public signs of distress that anyone could point to afterward and say, this was the moment. It unfolded the way many tragedies do, without spectacle, without witnesses, without interruption. At some point during that day, contact ceased. When authorities later arrived, they described the scene with the same careful language used in countless similar cases. There were no immediate indications of foul play, no forced entry, no signs of a struggle. The official tone was calm, restrained, final. For the public, that restraint created a strange dissonance. Because the woman who had been found was not an ordinary figure. She was someone whose life had been marked by extremes, fierce conviction, overwhelming grief, and relentless scrutiny. And yet, her final hours appeared almost painfully unremarkable. That contrast is difficult to sit with. There is something deeply unsettling about the idea that a voice capable of shaking institutions could disappear in silence. That after decades of confrontation, the last chapter contained no argument, no audience, no applause. If there were thoughts in those final hours, they were private. If there were moments of hesitation, they went unseen. If there was fear, or resignation, or peace, it was never recorded. All that remains are the boundaries of time, the last confirmed sightings, the last known location, the moment when the world realized she was gone. And in that absence, meaning rushes in, because when the details end, interpretation begins. In the days that followed, the story moved from shock to scrutiny. Authorities reiterated their position. There were no suspicious circumstances. The language was precise, clinical, designed to close the case as efficiently as possible. For many observers, that should have been the end of the conversation. But it wasn't. Almost immediately, public debate ignited not around conspiracy, but around context. Commentators, fans, and mental health advocates began asking a quieter, more uncomfortable question. Does not suspicious mean fully understood? Media outlets revisited Sinéad O'Connor's final years, replaying clips and resurfacing posts that now felt chilling. Her public admissions of despair, her descriptions of unbearable grief, her repeated statements about feeling abandoned by systems meant to help her. None of this was new, but in the aftermath of her death, it took on a new gravity. Some voices criticized the press itself. Had Sinéad been treated as a person in crisis or as a spectacle? Were her breakdowns reported with care or consumed as content? The same outlets that once dismissed her as unstable now praised her bravery, her honesty, her moral clarity. Others focused on the broader failure of support structures. Mental health services strained and fragmented. The music industry's long history of extracting vulnerability without providing protection. The loneliness that can persist even when one's pain is visible to millions. There were no credible allegations of foul play, no evidence to suggest external wrongdoing, but the absence of a crime did not erase the sense that something had gone profoundly wrong, because this was not a mystery in the traditional sense. It was a tragedy shaped by accumulation. Each ignored warning, each moment of public ridicule, each delay in meaningful support. Together, they formed a pattern, one that did not fit neatly into a police report, but lingered in the cultural conscience. In that way, the controversy surrounding Sinéad O'Connor's death was never about how she died. It was about why her suffering was allowed to continue for so long. And as the headlines slowly faded, one final question remained less accusatory, more reflective. What do we do differently next time? In the quiet, after the noise fades, what remains of Sinéad O'Connor is not a scandal, or a headline, or even a single unforgettable performance. What remains is a legacy that refuses to be simplified. She gave the world a voice that carried truth without compromise. She exposed abuse before it was safe to do so. She spoke openly about trauma when silence was the expected price of survival. And for that honesty, she paid with isolation, ridicule, and a lifetime of misunderstanding. In the days after her death, the world rushed to honor her courage. Tributes poured in. Apologies arrived too late. History adjusted its narrative. But those gestures cannot change the fact that for many years, Sinéad stood alone while telling uncomfortable truths about power, about pain, about what happens when society punishes vulnerability. If we look at her life through the lens of her final hours, one lesson becomes impossible to ignore. The cost of being heard should not be one's life. Sinéad O'Connor did not fail the world. The world failed to protect her. And as the last echoes of her voice linger raw, defiant, unforgettable, we are left with a responsibility. To listen more carefully, to respond sooner, to treat cries for help not as moments of spectacle, but as calls to action. Because the tragedy of her final hours was not that they were quiet, it was that they were predictable. And the true measure of her legacy will not be how loudly she is praised now, but whether we learn to hear the next voice before it falls silent.